Welcome to Everyday Economics, a podcast that helps you learn about the economic world happening around you every day. I'm your host, Chris Krug, president of the 501c3 nonprofit Franklin News Foundation. Everyday Economics is a production of America's Talking Network. You can check out all of our great podcasts at americastalking.com. To support Everyday Economics, please make your tax-deductible charitable contribution by clicking the link in the show description. We are recording on Friday, October 28th, and joining me is Dr. Orphe Divounguy. He's a PhD economist. Tell me about what's going on with the GDP. It's up 2.6%. What does that mean? Who cares at this point? I mean, my eggs are still $3.99 a gallon, man. $3.99 a dozen. I wish my gasoline was $3.99 a gallon, but it's not. It's $4 something.
You know, we're in a situation where we look at this number, and in fact, I think a lot of people reached out to me and said, you know, this economy doesn't seem right. It doesn't look good. You know, everybody's hurting. How could it be that GDP comes in at 2.6% annualized for the quarter in quarter three? And I say, look, the consumer is resilient, right? If they think about it, despite sternly high inflation, a plunging stock market.
Don't even get me started.
Stock market plunged in 2022.
Well, just this morning, I got
right. Inflation eroding budgets. You know, people are struggling. You know, paying gas, food, et cetera, et cetera. Spending did not crash. Consumer spending did not crash. It cooled. Right. This latest GDP report shows a very resilient U.S. consumer. But you know, there are heavy clouds gathering. Right. I think that's the part that people are feeling anxious about the future. There are heavy clouds gathering. You know, historically, residential investment hinted at the risk ahead. Residential investment fell from the sky in this report, weighing down GDP in the third quarter by falling 26% in this latest report. And that was mostly driven by the decline in new construction activity, but also brokers' commissions plunged. The slowing housing market activity is weighing down GDP in the U.S. So yeah, that kind of sums it up. You know, we have a resilient consumer. We have builders pulling back and slowing housing market activity, which is a sector that's highly cyclical, very interest rate sensitive. And this is exactly what the Fed was intending to do. We heard Powell talk about pain. This is exactly what the Fed intended to do. It intended to cool down an overheated housing market. This is happening. And the question is, you know, will we have weakness going forward? You know, heavy clouds are gathering. You know, you're looking at consumer spending cooling. You see net imports falling. You see prices remaining somewhat stubborn despite all of these factors. You have climate destruction, the destruction of supply chains and desperately needed housing and infrastructure that are maintaining price pressures. And so all of these factors indicate that we may not have reached the bottom yet.
So let's talk about that a little bit. And I think that, you know, we're all sort of trying to find our footing in this marketplace on so many different levels. How will we know when we've reached the bottom, or will we know when we've reached the bottom?
I mean, that's a great question. I think the Fed is still going to be looking at inflation. As long as inflation keeps surprising on the upside, the Fed will keep its foot on the brakes. To most observers, I think most people looking out there, experts looking at this data, it's very clear 2023 is going to be very weak. Perhaps we're finally going to get that recession that you've been talking about.
Well, I mean, we technically were in a recession, and now GDP has grown. I guess so. Help me to understand that. So we had 2 quarters of negative GDP, and so now that, you know, GDP comes in at up 2.6%. Yet you're talking about the future doesn't look good. Some were saying that was the blip, that the 2 quarters that we just experienced were the blip. Some people might argue that this is the blip. So what's your take on that?
First of all, we're not in a recession because our friends at the NBER didn't declare it a recession. Second, consumer spending was absolutely on fire throughout those 2 quarters and is still, in my opinion, still somewhat high. even in Q3 in this latest report. And of course, people have jobs. And as long as people have jobs, they're going to keep spending. What the big picture is that things are cooling. And that if we had not gotten flows from abroad, right? So the idea that the US is still somewhat resilient and that other economies are struggling right now, that basically boosted net exports in this last report, that we would have probably seen a much lower number. Everything I just mentioned is on its way down. A fall in residential investment has usually preceded downturns in economic activity, is telling me that if the Fed continues to apply the pressure, something's going to crack, and that they have to be extremely careful going forward. But no, we're still not in a recession, but the economy is cooling really fast.
Well, I appreciate your thoughts, and we'll agree to disagree. For Orphe Divounguy, this has been Chris Krug. Subscribe to Everyday Economics and dozens of other quality podcasts at americastalking.com.